Hi there, I'm Alfred Lambermont Weber, and we're with independent scientist Leuren Moret. Uh, Leuren Moret is an expert, a world expert on radiation, and she was an expert witness at the Tokyo International Tribunal for War Crimes in Afghanistan. Today, Leuren Moret has agreed to join us. Her point of view that we're going to explore is that the Japan earthquake and the nuclear events which took place at the nuclear power plant are in fact intentional, tectonic, and nuclear warfare. Today I want to mention is Sunday, March 20th, 2011. The events in Japan earthquake took place on 3/11, March 11th. Welcome,
Thank you.
Leuren. Yeah.
Thank you.
There are so many different aspects of this that in the course of this program, I think we'll be going over all of them. And many people have been talking about the fact that this earthquake and the subsequent nuclear power plant explosions, are part of an intentional nuclear attack. But you actually predicted this back in 2004 in a hallmark article in the Japan Times. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, I've been on 20 speaking tours in Japan in the last 10 years, um, warning the Japanese public about the danger of nuclear power plants and their new nuclear reprocessing plant in the north called Rokasho. And it was a very, very wonderful experience. I got to see Japan and to meet Japanese that you would never meet on a tour or a vacation or a holiday. I mean, really working with them on important issues. And I was able to use my background in the geosciences, my uh, extensive studies on the biological effects of radiation and on wildlife as well, including in the oceans. And I also met nuclear power plant engineers who were whistleblowers in Japan, and they gave me diagrams. They they educated me about the hazards of nuclear power in Japan and the specific weaknesses that are inherent to the nuclear power reactor and generation of electricity. So I was very, very well informed and traveled widely in Japan and worked at all levels with the common people, with the Ainu, who are the indigenous people of Japan, with um, scientists, Japanese scientists. They're some of the best in the world, with members of the Japanese parliament. So I worked from the bottom to the top and back to the bottom, and it was a tremendous education for me, perhaps more than what I even gave them. But certainly it was a very positive exchange. And as a result, I met many reporters, and one of them asked me to write an article about nuclear power plants and the danger of earthquakes in Japan. So I wrote this article using even diagrams that the whistleblowers had given me inside nuclear power plants and the danger of Japan as an island arc system sitting on top of four tectonic plates, these huge ocean plates that were all shoving each other around underneath Japan. And so it would be sort of like you or I, Alfred, trying to climb on top of a gunny sack with 4 pigs inside, struggling with each other and trying to stay on the top of that gunny sack. Well, that's exactly what Japan is trying to do in this tremendously dynamic oceanic tectonic setting. It's extremely dangerous. There is an 8.5 earthquake every 5 years in Japan, or greater than 8.5, and yet all of their nuclear power plants are on the ocean in order to get cooling, tremendous amounts of cooling water for the plants, and they are sitting on subduction zones and tectonic plate margins, boundaries that are very, very dangerous. And also they have erupting volcanoes in Japan. So I put all of that in the article. It was a very interesting article to write, and lo and behold, on March 11th, 2011, just about 6 years later, my article became reality.
Now, there are a number of possibilities there. One is that the earthquake, the 9.0 or 9.1 earthquake itself, was one of the recurring earthquakes, not 8.5, but was a mega event, but in that recurring zone. The other possibility was what you and I have been exploring, and that is a series of, in fact, tectonic attacks, earthquake attacks, using the force of earthquakes as a military type attack. And we've looked at a number of earthquakes: China in 2008, Haiti in 2010, Chile in 2010, perhaps others. That possibility is that the Japan earthquake of March 2011 was in fact a military strike, a tectonic attack using HAARP or some other mechanism to trigger that earthquake. Which do you think it was?
Well, the evidence that I've gathered up to this time indicates it was not a natural earthquake. It was a modified natural earthquake. In other words, it was initiated by external energy that was not inherent to the fault zone. And this is known as tectonic warfare, and it's part of the HAARP air-based, space-based, land-based, sea-based weapon system that was secretly developed during the Cold War by the Soviet Union and the United States together. The money for the development of this secret program, which was a huge, vast amount of money, was done. It was carried out under the cover of Star Wars and missile defense, and in fact, they were secretly developing this vast system to weaponize the energy that is inherent in natural processes. So, first, man weaponized chemical energy. That was the Chinese when they developed gunpowder to produce a shock wave that would destroy things. Then in World War II, under the Manhattan Project, man weaponized nuclear energy, which was much, much, much greater amounts of energy than chemical energy. And they produced the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the candles burning behind me are around a Madonna, a Japanese Madonna figurine from Nagasaki that was a gift to me. And it has the Japanese robes and clothes and style from the neck down, but the Asian woman who represents Mary has the Catholic Italian style scarf or draping over her head. And so the first nuclear weapons were dropped on a human population, were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Once the nuclear weapons were tested, it was found that they were pretty messy because they left a very, very politically incorrect mess behind, with lots of dead people and horrible radiation illnesses for all future generations and those who were exposed. And of course, the political backwash around the world. It was the U.S. really didn't want to do something like that again. It was very unpopular. So they immediately began, after World War II, to develop a new weapon system that would release tremendous amounts of energy for an even bigger shock wave. And what they did was develop tectonic warfare, weather warfare, mind control, missile defense, all of these very, very sophisticated applications in the HAARP weapon system. And I'd like to mention the Space Preservation Act in the House that was introduced by Congressman Dennis Kucinich in 2002, H.R. 2977, which you had a part in, and that is probably the best and most succinct document that really describes the HAARP system in a nutshell.
Right. I think that bill was actually introduced in October of 2001 and was, to my knowledge, the only piece of legislation in the U.S. Congress to date which has purported to even acknowledge and regulate the HAARP system. So
it was important for another reason, and that is that it included chemtrails,
right.
which have been politicized into laughable oblivion, or they've tried to. But I think the public is very, very concerned about chemtrails, and it was very important that that was included in that bill.
Yeah.
Because it is a part of the HAARP system.
In fact, the guest that preceded you, quite recently, we had Clifford Carnicom as a guest, and his work has shown that the function of chemtrails over the last decade, from 1999, all of this accelerated in the year 1999, according to his view regarding chemtrails, was that the chemtrails have functioned to turn the Earth's atmosphere into a plasma. And,
that's right.
And that the chemtrails planes that we see now are just to make sure that the plasma stays at a stable rate. And it's that plasma that the HAARP system uses as a plasma weapon.
Well, it's also an electromagnetic frequency mirror.
Right.
It reflects the HAARP transmissions as well.
Right. So now we have a modality that we've shown in other instances, and if people want to go to a particular website, it's www.peaceinspace.org. That's peaceinspace.org, and you can see the application of HAARP in triggering other similar tectonic events, that is, earthquake warfare, as I mentioned, ranging from China up till Haiti, up till Chile. What other sorts of signatures make you feel that this event was in fact an act of deliberate warfare, let's say initially against Japan, but also against North America and the planet?
There are a number of them. I would start with September the 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11, when FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that is the main responding agency for disasters in the U.S., they predicted, this is very strange, three disasters in the future. One was a terrorist event in New York City. It happened the next day on 9/11, 2001. They also predicted a hurricane disaster in disaster in New Orleans. That happened 4 years later in 2005 in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina. And I do have images of Hurricane Katrina from NASA that show an ionizing beam of energy coming down from space into the edge of Hurricane Katrina on the top. And that's how they steer hurricanes. They heat up one side of the hurricane and they can sort of drag it around like a wand, and they drag it over warmer water if they want to increase the energy in the hurricane and make it more violent and destructive, or they drag it over colder water and that decreases the energy and calms down the hurricane. So there are many reasons to think that, or that we know, HAARP was used on 9/11 and HAARP was used on Hurricane Katrina. And the third prophecy or prediction by FEMA was that there would be an earthquake disaster on the West Coast. Now, whether this is the disaster they were predicting or it's one that is yet to come, it will be related to earthquakes. And certainly, I can be fairly certain that it's going to affect a nuclear power plant somewhere on the West Coast.
Now, also, we have the strange behavior of the U.S. authorities. While Japan initially released the information that the March 11th, 2011 earthquake was a 9.0 or a 9.1 earthquake.
Before we go to that,
Yeah.
I'd like to mention that Westinghouse, GE and Westinghouse nuclear power plants are the ones built in Japan. And Westinghouse was sold to Hitachi, and Toshiba would get a part of it too, in February 2006 for $5.4 billion. Now, why would Westinghouse suddenly be sold? Actually, the Rockefellers own GE and Westinghouse. Why would they sell their company to Hitachi when they had maintained it for 50 years? 50 years in Japan, 60 years. It's very strange. And then in August of 2007, they sold 10% of Westinghouse, the Japanese did, to Kazakhstan for $540 million. And so this is beginning to smell a lot like Rockefellers and the Clintons and the Bushes and this criminal cabal of politicians, military-industrial complex, and energy that is really creating havoc all over the world. And of course, they're the ones who are using HAARP and benefiting from HAARP. So I think there's more and more evidence when you really look at many facets of this that indicate this was a HAARP event. Go ahead with your comments about the earthquake intensity.
Yeah,
Or shall I
well,
answer?
we have the anomaly that the Japanese came out initially saying that it was a 9.0 earthquake, but the U.S. came out initially saying it was a 6.7 earthquake, which is, totally false, although they were reporting it both on the same from the same set of sensors worldwide. Was the U.S. trying to hide something?
Well, certainly, I noticed immediately that Japan, and I know a lot of Japanese scientists and seismologists and geologists, and I noticed that immediately after the earthquake, Japan stated it was a 9.0 or a 9.1. That intensity has never been reported in Japan in the last 150 years of monitoring and studying earthquakes and the intensity of earthquakes. So there was another flag that this was an off-scale event which hadn't been reported before. And then I noticed that the US began reporting it was a 6.7, a 7.1, then a 7.3. And what was most puzzling to me is that the international seismic network with stations all over the world is shared by all countries. And so the US and Japan would have been analyzing the same data and yet coming up with very different answers, although Japan never changed their assessment from 9.0 or 9.1. So then it went from 7.3 that the US was reporting, then they changed it to 7.9. Finally, they changed it to 8.9, but like charging 99 cents for something instead of a dollar, it seemed like it was a psychological sort of attempt to downplay or minimize the intensity, the unusual intensity of this earthquake. And finally, just more than a week after that earthquake, they finally said it was a 9.0. That is very, very strange. I know USGS, the United States Geological Survey, very well. There are very, very good scientists there, and they would not do that. It would be a politicized scientific assessment rather than a scientist presenting what his estimate was based on scientific data. Someone above him in the administrative area was changing the intensity for political purposes. It was not the scientist.
Today in Canada, we were listening to a very interesting radio program with an 82-year-old retired English professor in Hiroshima who was actually an Ibakusha himself also. He was a survivor of the atomic bomb. And they asked him, well, what do you think of this event? He said, I think it was the third atomic bombing of Japan. And that was from the words. And in fact, you have come across data that show that this event is about the power of 1 million nuclear bombs dropped on that area of Japan. I wonder if you could explain that to us.
Yes. What I did was I contacted Marion Folk, who was a Manhattan Project scientist in World War II, and he later became involved in the nuclear weapons program at Los Alamos in Livermore and worked at Livermore the last 20 years of his career. He actually is the one who solved the problems on the hydrogen bomb. In other words, the mathematicians and the physicists who were involved could not make it work. Marion Folk sat down and solved all the problems, and he is responsible for for the success of the creation of the U.S. hydrogen bomb. So I called him up. He's my best friend. He's 90 years old. He's taught me everything I know and the philosophy of things and how to speak correctly, how to educate the public with the truth. And he started 10 years ago and has spent a lot of time with me. He said, I never supported atmospheric testing. I don't think anybody outside of a nuclear power plant should get exposed to radiation from the plant or from the bombs. And you will be my spokesman for the rest of your life, my spokesperson. So I've been to 50 countries in the last 10 years speaking about this. And I called him up and I said, Marion, how much energy was released in this bomb? And I'm sorry, in this earthquake. And he sat down and spent about 2 days calculating, and he came up with an answer. And he said, I used the amount of energy that was released by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Together, it was about 30 kilotons, which means it was the energy that would be released by an equivalent 30,000 tons of TNT or dynamite. And he calculated the amount of energy in joules. It was 132 times 10 to the 18th joules. That would be for a 9.0 earthquake. And that is the equivalent of 1,031 kiloton bombs, nuclear bombs, which is the combined yield of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that is exactly what tectonic warfare and HAARP is about. They are using the energy that they can trigger the release of in nature, and it creates a huge shock wave and does tremendous damage and kills a lot of people. And so how could you drop 1 million atomic bombs on Japan and get away with it? It would be impossible. But you could trigger an earthquake silently, invisibly. No one even knows it. They think it's a natural event, and you're releasing more energy than you could ever release in a weapon from a weapon, an atomic weapon, and it's the equivalent of 1 million nuclear bombs. So not only that, this is a very, very complex, interlocking, interrelated fault zone. It's where two plates are colliding. So you have tremendous stresses, tremendous amounts of energy stored up in every part of that, every fault line in that system of faults, on echelon faults. And so once that one was triggered, every fault in that system has to adjust to the change in the stress and the strain. And so we are sure to have another major earthquake in this zone, as well as the minor quakes. I don't think 6 and 7 are so minor, though. But this earthquake zone will be adjusting itself for a number of months to come. And Marion Falk pointed out there's sure to be at least a magnitude 7 to 8 earthquake ahead of us.
Now, carrying that same kind of analysis and looking at the amount of radiation that has been released in this quake nuke bomb, you were mentioning earlier that you looked at the number of rods and the number of, I guess, assemblies in each of these units and began to look at the total number of nuclear bomb equivalents and at the radiation that is being released not only over Japan, but over the northern hemisphere, which includes the Pacific Ocean, North America, Northern Europe, Northern Asia, the Atlantic Ocean. Could you take us through all of that?
Well, the first thing, the first line of evidence was I investigated what actually happened after the earthquake. And I teased this information out of many sources in the media and reporting, and then independent reporters and journalists and interviews with people. Also, technicians and engineers um, made a lot of comments in news stories and videotapes that were put on the internet in Japanese. And I have a wonderful Japanese activist who is spending this time with me because I don't think he or I could survive the stress and the sadness and the reality of what this disaster, global disaster, means. So he came to stay with me, and we have fortunately he's translated and interpreted a lot of documents and videos for me, so I have information that other people who do not speak Japanese have. But what happened is the earthquake happened, and there's a backup cooling pump system that automatically turns on in the event of an earthquake. That went on. An hour later, the tsunami hit, and a 30-foot wave went over the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The diesel pump is in the basement underneath the reactor, and that tidal wave flooded the diesel backup system. And from the news reports, I finally found comments that there was no cooling system working until the next night after the earthquake and tsunami. Now, Alfred, a reactor goes into meltdown 90 minutes after the cooling stops. So, an hour and a half, 90 minutes after the tsunami, those reactors that were in operational mode were in meltdown. And they continued in meltdown until the next night when they got the battery backup system working and pumping through the reactor and the cooling pools. The problem started when those pumps went on because the cooling water was in contact with the uranium fuel pellets that were in the nuclear power fuel rods, which is basically a zirconium tube with these pellets in it, and they weigh about 1,200 pounds each. And as I said, there were 60 rods in an assembly and 400 assemblies in the Unit 1 reactor. So when the water came in contact with the pellets, and this is about the time that it was just about the time sometime it was about the time that the first explosion happened. The water came in contact with those fuel pellets, which have 6% uranium in them. They were super hot, and some of them were melted, and so the water reacted and created zirconium oxide and hydrogen. And hydrogen is lighter than air, so it floated up to the top of the reactor building and collected under the roof until it was down. It had filled the whole area all the way down to where the cooling pools were, and then the explosion happened. That blew the roof off of the Unit 1 building, and it also damaged the cooling pool so that the water was leaking out. And by that time, the melted uranium rods had also probably burned down, melted through the casing of the reactor, and so water was leaking out of that too. They couldn't keep water enough water in the pools or in the reactor to cover the rods. So they started burning. The rods in the cooling pool started burning. And that created a huge radioactive cloud disaster with we don't even know how much fission products were released from the rods in the cooling pool. They represent chemically and physically, basically, radiologically, what comes out of a bomb, a nuclear bomb, after it explodes. So I decided to calculate the equivalent number of nuclear bombs that were in just Unit 1 in the reactor. And what I discovered was that there are 72 pounds of uranium per rod. There were 60 rods times 400 in the Unit 1, and that calculated out to be the equivalent of 96,000 nuclear bombs. That's in one reactor.
Right. Now,
So that's just one reactor. They have 600,000, more than 500,000 spent fuel rods that are much hotter than, oh, I'm sorry, it's the fuel rods in the pool that have the fission products. The rods in the reactors are uranium and some fission products, but not nearly as dangerous as the rods in the cooling pools. So 600,000 spent fuel rods placed in cooling pools on top of the reactors is just complete insanity. There's no margin of safety. It's just complete insanity.
right. So this is radiation now that has been released into the atmosphere or is being released into the atmosphere?
It's being released into the atmosphere. Dr. Chu, who's the head of the Department of Energy, has stated recently in the media that the problem is pretty close to being solved. There's no more danger. Everything, people should be calm. And he reassured everyone that there was minimal danger now. However, the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has said it is so radioactive, and almost on the same day and the same time, he said it is so radioactive, this was on March 18th or 19th, that that there is a lethal dose to anyone at that plant in a very short time. And that is also why they are cycling workers through for short periods of time so to decrease or minimize the exposure to them. But basically, the firefighters, the self-defense forces, the volunteer workers, and the workers who are there not voluntarily are really kamikaze emergency responders because they are going to die.
Well,
they're going to die of radiation exposure.
Let's shift over to the other side of the Pacific, and that is to the west coast of North America, specifically to the Bay Area where you're located. Now,
yes,
you said that on the very same night, the 18th of March, there were HAARP signatures, namely some kind of whirling type clouds.
Tornado yeah. Vortex. Yes. What happened?
Tornado. Yeah. Go ahead and tell us.
What happened? Now, this is very interesting. This is definitely another HAARP signature on this whole disaster. On Friday morning, March 18th, the radiation arrived on the Pacific coast of North America from the explosion caused by the first reactor, the hydrogen blast. And at the whole day before, there was very, very, very heavy chemtrailing all over the Bay Area, very heavy, and also on the morning of March 18th. At 11 o'clock, the sky suddenly went dark. There was lightning and strong winds and thunder. The lights flickered and went off and then came back on again. And this was going on for 10 minutes, and suddenly at 11:10 a.m., 10 minutes after this started, the television announced to everyone in the Bay Area tornado warnings. And they said everyone should put a big towel around your head and across your mouth and go down in your basement and stay there until this is over. And then as that announcement was being announced on TV, huge, heavy, torrential rain started just pouring down. California has an average of 14 inches of rain a year. We're getting an inch of rain a day now well, for some time. We've had a very rainy winter, but now when that rain started, I looked at the weather forecast, and for the next 10 days, at least 2 weeks, there is rain predicted every single day.
Now, there are at least 17 different HAARP locations around the planet.
Yes.
And we don't know which specific, or do we know which specific HAARP locations, for example, were used to trigger the Japan earthquake?
Well, it's an integrated system, and so basically they can sit there anywhere at a computer, anywhere in the world. They don't even have to be at a HAARP facility, and they can cause events that happen anywhere on the rest of the planet.
Right. So, right.
The chemtrails are used as I mentioned, they're used as electromagnetic frequency mirrors. And so they put them up in the sky, and they can transmit HAARP radio signals that are extra low frequency ELF or ultra low frequency ULF or even VHS, and they bounce those signals, they have very long wavelengths, off of those chemtrail mirrors, and that way they can transmit all the way around the world by using those mirrors to bounce off the these waves around the world.
So
it could be Alaska, it could be in a lab at Los Alamos or Livermore, it could be on the Berkeley campus, it could be a Navy ship out at sea, it could be a plane up in the air. This is an integrated global system, air-based, space-based, land-based, and sea-based. It could be anywhere.
Anywhere. Now, just to follow up on the last question about the rain in the Bay Area, assuming that was integrated with, because it is anomalous, and it's integrated with the earthquake in Japan and the nuclear cloud coming over, the purpose of the rain would be so that the maximum fallout would fall out on the residents of the Bay Area. Is that it?
It would be maximum rain out of the radioactive materials, particles, and gases that are being transported across the Pacific. Now, that Friday arrival was, as I mentioned, the radiation from the explosion and fire at Unit 1. That was the spent fuel rods in the pools that had all the water leaked out, so they caught on fire. And those are extremely, extremely dangerous and very short half-life isotopes in those fuel rods, along with longer half-life. There's plutonium in them and a lot of other stuff. So now in the media and in the articles, a lot of people who've been interviewed have talked about the jet stream transporting that radioactive material, the particulates, to the Pacific coast and around the world. It's not being transported by the jet stream. The jet stream has transported nuclear bomb material that was injected very high into the atmosphere where the jet stream is. What I observed, and the Manhattan Project scientist Marian Folk observed in video clips of the explosions of the three reactor buildings, is that smoke and detritus and particulates floated up maybe to 300 feet off the ground, and that is being transported at very low altitude all across Japan, all across the Pacific, and it's in the troposphere, which is from the ground to about 60 miles from the surface of the Earth. That is the most energetic, the most dynamic and turbulent part of the entire atmosphere. It's where all of the moisture, the storm fronts, the hurricanes, the rain, the snowstorms, and it's moisture, it's rain that collects on the surface of these particles that are highly charged. Moisture condenses on them until they're a raindrop, and then they fall out of the sky and contaminate our drinking water and our environment and our shoes. And if you get it on your hands, that stuff goes right through your skin into your body, your tissues, your blood. So it's extremely dangerous. The other thing that's so dangerous about pollution, radionuclides polluting the troposphere, is that almost all of that, almost 100%, is rained out in 2.5 months. The nuclear bomb tests were in the 50s and 60s, and that 85% of that nuclear material from the bomb tests is still up at high altitude, even in lower orbital space. And so what we're looking at, we're living through, is the most efficient form of nuclear war, and they even knew this in 1948 and published it in the newspaper.
Now, let's move across to the West Coast. We've moved there and we're going to stay there, and we're going to bring up the case of Diablo Canyon. So tell us about that.
Well, when I realized that the Niigata earthquake was foreshadowing for the Fukuoka plant, because it's just on the other side of the island. It's on the China Sea side of Honshu, which is the main island in Japan. And then on the east coast, directly opposite, was the Fukuoka reactor or plant. And then I started realizing, oh my goodness, the Fukuoka nuclear power plant, or Fukushima, I'm sorry, Fukushima, those two plants are sitting on the edge of the same oceanic plate that our Diablo Canyon reactor and San Onofre reactors are sitting on. So we have a mirror situation in the United States, in California, with two operating nuclear power plants in Southern California, down by San Diego, that's where San Onofre is, and Diablo Canyon in San Luis Obispo, which is north of Los Angeles. And that is on the San Andreas Fault, which is also a subduction zone, exactly like the one that Japan is sitting on. So here are parallel mirror situations reflecting each other, and FEMA has announced that there will be an earthquake disaster on the West Coast at some time, and I think I am very worried and really very concerned about the Diablo Canyon and the San Onofre plants.
Well, now geologist Jim Birkeland, in fact, has come out with some prognostications. I know that today is the March 20th, his second day of his window up through March 26th.
Well, what's interesting, Yes. What is interesting, Jim Birkeland is a geologist. I know him. He's a very, very interesting man. And he worked at the USGS, United States Geological Survey, near San Jose for 6 years. He was in a uh, earthquake prediction group or office there, research group, and he was predicting earthquakes much more accurately than anyone else in that group. And the newspapers were interviewing him. He had a very, very good prediction record. And finally, one of the journalists said, "Well, how did you? How they have millions of dollars to do modeling and computers and everything. How in the world did you predict these earthquakes more accurately than they did?" "Oh," he said, "well, I look at the tide charts for the tides in the Bay Area and and other places, and I look at the lost pet column in the newspaper." And the reporter said, "Could you explain that, please?" And Birkeland said that changes in the electromagnetic field for 2 or 3 days before an earthquake um, that warn animals or alert animals to an earthquake happening. And what Marian Folk has explained to me and shown me is that before an earthquake, the stress and the strain and the changes in the fault zone where this earthquake is going to happen, you can see sheets of electrons shooting up for hundreds of miles into the atmosphere along the surface, the plane of the fault. And he said actually astronauts in space on the space station actually saw it. They could see the electron glow before a major earthquake that they observed from space. And the Chinese have used a cricket in a little cage to predict earthquakes because the behavior of the cricket changes when an earthquake is imminent. In the Sumatra earthquake, not a single animal was lost or drowned or injured by that earthquake because they detected the electromagnetic changes that indicate an earthquake, and they all ran up into the jungle to high ground. There were dogs and cats and elephants and everything in between running up from the coastline into the jungle, and so none of them were injured or drowned. But too many people weren't aware of the tsunami. They were vacationing there or walking on the beach or something, and an awful lot of people drowned because of that or died in that disaster. So so Birkeland, Jim Birkeland, goes and looks for high tides because the tides, very high tides, add an additional tremendous amount of stress from the weight or the mass of the water, which is higher than normal or heavier than normal. And he said that in the San Francisco Bay Area, October, March, and April are the earthquake months for the biggest earthquakes that have occurred in the San Francisco Bay region. And he said that the animals, even pets, run away and try to hide. And so he looks in the lost pet columns in the newspaper, and when there's a high tide and there are a lot of pets lost, he said that's the window of opportunity. It's a seismic window for an earthquake. Now, what he said is March 19th to March 26th, 2011, just a week and a half after the Fukushima earthquake and nuclear disaster in Japan, is a seismic window with a full moon. An hour later, it is the closest approach of the moon to Earth until 2016 that causes tidal gravity influences or pulls on the Earth. The next day is the um, equinoctial tidal maximum on March 20th. And in addition, there are ocean tides and earth tides and groundwater tides that are all operational and add to invisibly to the stresses and the strain on an earthquake zone. So this seismic window, March 19th to 26th, is a top seismic window, a very, very, very likely window of time when a major earthquake can happen. And he said there are also really high tides coming up, and he predicts a heavy earthquake. And the humans and animals have, and even bacteria have magnetite in their brains or somewhere in their bodies, and they can detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field. Even we can navigate ourselves, but we have lost contact in touch with nature, so we're not aware of it. But animals do respond to changes in the magnetic field. And he said some of the indicators of an imminent earthquake are the beaching of whales that occurred in the Bay Area before the last big World Series earthquake, and beaching of whales around Sumatra at the time that happened. Now, what's really interesting is I talked to women in Malaysia, which is not very far from Sumatra, and I was talking about HAARP at the International War Crimes Conference that I attended there, and as well with you, and at the invitation of the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tun Dr. Mahathir. But these women told me that for a week before the Sumatra earthquake, they could not work, they could not concentrate in their offices. They said something electromagnetic was happening and their brains were simply scrambled. As soon as the Sumatra earthquake occurred, those symptoms disappeared.
Right.
So there are many indicators, there are many avenues and strands of evidence that you have to put together to finally convince people and yourself that these are truly HAARP events. And they sure are, especially when you look at the foreshadowing and then the economic benefit, cui bono, who is benefiting from these events. And usually it's the bankers.
Right, right. Now, we've just about come to the end of the segment, but I have one final sort of area of question, and it's this.
Yes.
When I broached the subject of how to stop HAARP, ban HAARP, and
Yes.
chemtrails, the associated plasma weapon component, with Clifford Carnicom, he said that he and the Carnicom Institute would be very much in favor of that and would back that. And I know that you would as well, because we have worked together on such a treaty. And so it's just a matter of getting that treaty, and we have the Carnicom Institute behind it and yourself. And I want to ask this kind of because you're there in California. Back in the early 80s, I was a resident of California. I lived in Los Angeles, and Jerry Brown, like now, was governor of California. And I was a member of the governor's committee on earthquake preparedness. I had written a book called The Age of Cataclysm, and somehow I got nominated to it. So what comes around goes around, and Jerry Brown is governor once again. Do you think that Jerry Brown is free enough of entanglement with the Illuminati that he would back the anti-HAARP treaty if we went to him with it, if we showed him that this is a type of harm that's coming to California and to California residents?
Well, let me put it this way. When I became a whistleblower in 1991 at the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab, I blew the whistle to Richard Berta, who was the Western Regional Inspector for the Inspector General's office at the Department of Energy. And what he said to me, we had many talks. He was married to a college friend of mine. He said, Leuren, the nuclear weapons labs exist for the Pentagon, and the Pentagon exists for the oil companies. And after Jerry Brown was inaugurated and was in office in January of 2011, he almost immediately exempted the oil companies and some other entity from taxes or targeting or regulation. And in other words, he set them aside. Oh, it was the unions, I think. He set them aside and he said, he didn't say it, but we knew that he was saying, I just can't touch them. So if these weapons of mass destruction exist for the oil companies, he's not going to do it.
He's not going to do it. Okay,
no.
Well,
he cannot do it. He cannot do it.
We're like
he might
Socrates.
Want to do it.
We're still searching for the honest public servant, the honest politician. In the meantime, know that we have the support, public support of Clifford Carnicom and the Carnicom Institute, and we'll be coming to you with the draft treaty and making that public and moving forward with that. We certainly want to thank you. And of course, as this important story develops, asking you to join us in the future. Are there any kind of final words that you'd like to leave with our audience?
I can hardly believe what is happening. I can't even describe the terror that I felt for the last 10 days over this disaster in Japan. But this is a new form of warfare. It's much, much, much more venal, malicious, and efficient. And we are now ruled and controlled by a totalitarian scientific oligarchy. It's up to us to stop these people because they are exterminating the population, the human and animal population on this entire planet.
Just in the very small particular terms, what can the individual person do in terms of their diet and other things they can intake to guard against these radioactive clouds as they come over?
Well, not only the radioactive clouds, but American people are extremely undernourished. So they need to take in iodine. You can put a tincture of iodine just on your skin, and it goes right into your body. Every cell in your body requires iodine. The iodine in our bodies has been reduced 50% in the last 20 or 30 years. We're starving to death. So seaweed, you can buy it in health food stores or herbal shops. Tincture of iodine, you can even put it on the skin on your neck, on where your thyroid is. It goes right into the thyroid. Eating miso soup and highly colored fruit and vegetables, and steam baths or saunas helps to cause sweating, and the stuff comes out in the sweat. But one thing that is very important, I want to really strongly recommend, are reverse osmosis filters on the water coming into your house. That removes a lot of the radiation from the water.
Okay.
And becoming more aware. And thank you so much, Alfred, for doing all the wonderful interviews that you've done, that we've done together. It's so important. You're a wonderful fountain of knowledge. You have tremendous insight. You've had very interesting life experiences, and it's what makes the interviews so interesting. And I know the audience is enjoying it because they keep listening. So thank you so much for empowering the public.
Amen. Well, let's we look forward to being with you again in the future.
Thank you, Alfred.
Thank you.
And God bless the Japanese.
Indeed.